I'm honored to welcome Harsha Walia and Mizue Aizeki for today's conversation on Harsha's recent book, Border and Rule, Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism from Haymarket Press. Trained in law, Harsha is a community organizer and campaigner in migrant justice, feminist, anti-capitalist, abolitionist, and anti-imperialist movements. In addition to Border and Rule, Harsha is also the award-winning author of Undoing Border Imperialism from AK Press. Mizue Aizeki is the interim executive director of Immigrant Defense Project. Mizue's work focuses on ending the injustices, including criminalization, imprisonment, and exile at the intersections of the criminal and immigrant systems. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Mizue to get us started with this conversation.
Thank you so much, Hasmin, for that introduction. I am joining you from traditional unceded territory of the Lenape people. I'm really excited to be here tonight. Thank you all for tuning in, and just very, very excited to be speaking with Harsha and learning more from you this evening. Since our time is tight, let's just kind of jump right into the questions, if that's okay. So one of the things that comes through very powerfully in your book is helping us understand how the border is not just it's not a fixed line, but also how the process of bordering pushes far into the interior, but also far beyond outside the United States boundaries. And relatedly, you have us think about imperialism, not as it's most often thought about as being like a driver, a cause of a migration, but also imperialism as being central. I mean, bordering regimes being central to the maintenance of empire and imperialism. Can you talk a little bit more about that and why that analysis matters for organizers?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I'm so excited to be in conversation. And I will just take 30 seconds to just thank everyone for being here. And to all of the organizers for having us in conversation. And thank you so much to the interpreters and the language justice team for that really thorough introduction, and just much gratitude and respect to everyone involved. And I'm on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people and nations, the lands of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish. And I think, this is very much connected to this question because of course, one of the things that the border does is that it exists as a tool of empire on indigenous nations, right? So bordering regimes and the physical border, in the case of the U.S.-Canada border or the U.S.-Mexico border, very much infringes on indigenous sovereignty and on the jurisdiction and laws and title of indigenous nations. And in terms of, what this means expansively in terms of empire in an internationalist lens, I really appreciate this question because I think it really is a kind of pressing frame of analysis that I hope we can build out in our movement. And that is exactly as you put it, that imperialism is not just the cause or driver of displacement and migration, but that I think increasingly migration management and immigration diplomacy is a central pillar of imperialism today. And we see that in ways, that are increasingly becoming stark and clear, with the US forcing different agreements with Mexico and countries in Central America. We see that in the European Union, where the frontiers of border militarization are not the EU, but it's countries in the Sahel region of Africa or the Middle East, where countries that are in the global South, who are caught up in a matrix of existing imperialism, are now being forced to accept trade or aid agreements. And we, of course, know trade and aid agreements are a way of maintaining imperial dependency and our forced impoverishment, right? It's the carrot and the stick approach. And one of the conditions increasingly of trade and aid agreements is migration prevention campaigns, where countries are forced to accept border outsourcing within this matrix of imperial relations. And, one of the most, I could go on, but I'll be brief, but I think a stark example is that of Nauru. And Nauru is, an island in the Oceania region. And in certain years, 1/3 of Nauru's GDP was aid by Australia, with, of course, the conditions that Nauru build an entire infrastructure of outsourced migration detention centers in Nauru. in order to incarcerate migrant detainees and refugees that were trying to make it to Australia. And so I think the frontiers of border militarization are increasingly, not the US-Mexico border, for example, but increasingly in Mexico, in Guatemala, and US officials even say this, right? That our southern border is now the border between Mexico and Guatemala. And so I think border outsourcing is increasingly a pillar of maintaining imperial relations and multiplying the border and globalizing racial violence, racial capitalism, and maintaining imperialism by managing migration through imperial dynamics.
Yeah, I don't know if people listening caught this, but on the first day in office, President Biden issued his U.S. Citizenship Act, and like buried in that very large bill, he sends it to Congress. Was something called promoting the rule of law, security, and economic development in Central America. And right there, it lays very clearly what you're talking about, Harsha, is this provision that in order to get the full aid package, you have to commit to border security. So making sure people can't migrate out. One of the things I love about your book, it is so rich with history, and there's just a lot of analysis and the intersectionality of all these issues. And, I started doing this migrant justice organizing in the 90s. And so it was right before, around 93. So right before Operation Gatekeeper, right before NAFTA, right before the Zapatista uprising. And, one of the things that I've heard you speak about and also touch upon in your book is the impact of all these things also on indigenous people in Mexico and Central America and elsewhere. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the importance of the convergence of these things: border militarization, neoliberalism, free trade, carceral governance in the 90s, and how the role that it continues to play in shaping our current political landscape. I know it's a lot, but I just think that, when you live through it, it kind of sticks with you. So I think just maybe for people who don't think that much about the World Bank or, free trade, like what are some of the lessons we should be, or things we should be thinking about as we build out strategies for justice?
Yeah, all so quickly. Thank you. And thank you.
I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. No, and thank you for these incisive questions. And I think, I appreciate it for many reasons, including the fact that right now is a time, I hope, of resurgence in rethinking or continuing to shed light on institutions like the WTO, right? As we're bearing witness to massive global vaccine apartheid and the role that the WTO plays in that. I hope that continues to shine light on these institutions like the World Trade Organization, like the World Bank, like the International Monetary Fund, et cetera. And that kind of transnational project of economic neoliberalism. I think, the connections between all of these, if we could summarize it as quickly as possible, is that free trade agreements are an escalation of capitalism, right? And it's an attempt to really internationalize and maintain, again, forms of imperialism by claiming free trade in what is inherently unfree trade and unfair trade. And really the pillars of free trade agreements like NAFTA, like the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is not an anomaly, right? There's over 600 trade agreements that have been signed in the past few decades, and they all have some central pillars, which is privatization, an agenda of neoliberalism, of austerity, and centrally, the question around how that impacts indigenous peoples is that the agenda of privatization, especially of land, is really an attempt to both simultaneously dismantle indigenous jurisdiction and to convert land that is often held communally in different indigenous social and legal orders into fee simple capitalist private property. And in Mexico, one of the ways that we saw this most starkly was that one of the provisions of NAFTA called for the abolition of Article 27 in the Mexican Constitution. And that article was one of the kind of leftovers of the revolutionary Mexican Constitution after 1910. And it protected to some degree ejidos, right? Communally held land, communally held both by peasants and by indigenous communities. And what NAFTA wanted to do was to turn communally held land into private property, which is, again, in order to further capitalist interests, in order to further the interests of multinational corporations, to exploit and extract and commodify land. And also simultaneously, that process of commodification undermines indigenous legal jurisdiction, and again, land held in common. And so it was not a coincidence, and this is, of course, the logic of capitalism and colonization, is that none of these are coincidences, they are consequences. One of the consequences of this was that indigenous peoples faced some of the highest rates of displacement from their lands, right? And then that became the so-called migration crisis in the 1990s that led to Operation Gatekeeper and the militarization of the border that you mentioned, gatekeeper, safeguard, etc. And that convergence, I think, is critical, because oftentimes they're talked about as separate phenomenon, like NAFTA happened in 94 and the border started getting militarized, but they're deeply connected, right? Like, the political elite tried to argue that free trade agreement is trickle down. But I think one of the ways in which it's so obvious is that it's not trickle down. It's not a trickle down economy, and that it's actually an economy of dispossession, is that they started militarizing the border, right? If they actually thought that trade agreements would bring wealth and prosperity, they wouldn't also be militarizing the border. They knew that it would result in mass displacement. And so they know this. And I think it's important for us to also make those connections. And the kind of connection to carcerality is this convergence between the domestic kind of realm of increased austerity within the United States, if you will, right? The war on crime, the war on drugs, which saw the explosion of the prison industrial complex, and especially, of course, anti-Black measures of containment and immobilization and social control and genocide. And then this international, transnational phenomenon, which is also carceral, right? Like, militarizing the border is a carceral response. And I think in this way, the border is a really important fulcrum through which we can see the connection between national policies of austerity, neoliberalism, and carcerality, to this global response of, again, also neoliberalism, privatization, dispossession from land, and border controls. And I think in that way, the border serves as a kind of fulcrum between the so-called local and the global to really connect, as you put it, all of these issues.
Thank you. It's very rich, and everyone's has already read in the book or will read it. But I do think that, part of why this is so critical too, I mean, obviously a lot happened before the 90s, but I think what you mentioned, all those things coming together, the, Operation Gatekeeper, fortifying the physical US-Mexico boundary, but also the 1996 immigration laws, which, lay a good part of the legal framework for the mass detention and mass deportation and mass exclusion that we're experiencing, this sustained, permanent state of emergency, right, against migrant control. So I'm going to pivot a little bit to a different question. As someone who's been working on these issues for a while, it's still been even longer than I've been working on it, that there's been a law passed in the United States that offered kind of a pathway to legalization for a large group of people, right? So it's been close to 35 years since a law that enabled that. And so that's kind of the political context in which we're living in, where people are still fighting for some kind of immigration reform. But the framework that exists is if there's going to be legalization or expansion of rights for some people, it can only be offered at the cost of another group of people, right? So it's reinforcing a framework of hierarchy, belonging for some, and continued exclusion for the vast majority of people in the world. And so whether that's exclusion at the border or deportation of people with certain criminal convictions. And so it's a bit of a dilemma in the sense that, while citizenship is a very real and tangible right that provides stability and some level of protection that you need to engage in power building, it also comes as a compromise, right, by reinforcing a system of belonging and exclusion that's been fundamental to the settler colonial foundation of this country. So it'd be great to hear your thinking on like what are some of the ways that our movements can grapple with this contradiction through a liberatory framework.
The hardest questions. Thank you. And you can tell they come from just your vast experience. So thank you. Yeah, I think maybe a few things, and I'll slow down. Thank you for that nod. In terms of citizenship, one of the things that I think we have to be particularly thoughtful about is precisely that, right? How do we, when we call, leaving aside the whole notion of citizenship for a second and returning to it, but a lot of pathways to citizenship are inherently exclusionary. They're often dependent and reinforce very particular social hierarchies and oppression, particularly between good and bad immigrants, deserving, undeserving immigrants, right? They reproduce those categories. And in ways that reinforce social hierarchies that are already existing. So, proximity to whiteness, people with certain class access, with post-secondary educations, people without criminal backgrounds, and we can go on and on, people who are productive in the wage economy, all of these kinds of notions of good and desirable, all of which reproduce, anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, ableism, gendered hierarchies, and more and more and more. And so I think it's so important at the outset not to accept as a compromise any citizenship pathways that reinforce those kinds of divisions, right? Like in our organizing that I've been involved in, and with No One is Illegal, we've always been clear that there can't even be a pathway to citizenship, because often pathways to citizenship are based on, length of residency, or exclude people who are just arriving at the border. So we call for full status for all upon arrival with zero exclusions, and refuse to accept kind of anything less than that. And I'm not in a position to comment on what other movements are doing in other places, but just to acknowledge that that's a very live debate in many places, right? Like how to deal with these immigration compromise reforms. And I think it's important to say no to them, because they really come at the expense of people, right? And they come at the expense of people that, again, reproduce, that's not a coincidence, that reproduce very directly social hierarchies of anti-Blackness, of ideas of criminality, etc. And I think here, there's a lot that we can continue to learn from abolitionist movements, and thinking here of Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Mariam Kaba's work around rejecting the politics of innocence. And I think a lot of immigration reform work really reproduces the idea of innocence, of someone being deserving, someone having to tell their story, someone having to justify their humanity, when in fact I think the task is, and what I aim to do in my work with Border and Rule, is to turn the gaze away from migrants constantly having to justify our humanity, right? Whether it's like, oh, we're producing the economy, the economy would not survive without immigrants, which is true, but also reinforces the idea that this country is built on, which is the exploitation of immigrant labor, right? The commodification of immigrant labor. So I think it's really important to reject those kinds of humanizing narratives in the face of dehumanization, in as much as it may make sense, but rather to turn the gaze back at the state and the systems. So refusing those compromises. And I think the second thing is absolutely that, to challenge the notion of citizenship, one that is always inherently written against, especially Indigenous and Black communities, right? Citizenship was forced and denied in very particular ways, in the logic of settler colonialism and enslavement. And so it's really important not to maintain the myth of citizenship as a right, that once it's gained, it leads to it leads to some kind of utopic horizon. But that said, it's absolutely true that it's a harm reduction strategy, right? That people do need to access citizenship in order to not live in fear, in order to not be precarious, in order to not be undocumented. And I think, here it's possible, as it is in any movement, to fight for things that are, as the Panther Party would remind us, that are non-reformist reforms. And there are some pathways to immigration citizenship that, again, if they reinforce divisions between people, or if they maintain the myth of citizenship as a kind of multicultural neoliberal rights-based phenomenon that undermine that utopic vision. And then I think there's a way to say, listen, this is what people need in order to live freer in this moment, but it's not the horizon, right? It's not what we want. Citizenship is not liberation. And the last thing that I'll offer is that one of the things that I feel strongly about and argue in the book is that I think a no border politics is different than an open border politics. And, here an open border politics is similarly that idea, right? Like, why don't we just open up the border and then people can live and migrate and live freely? But I think the challenges of an open border movement is that it assumes that the world will still be stratified in the way that it is, right? That people will still be, quote unquote, rushing to come to the West, because we assume that the imperial relationships between the South and the North will be maintained, and that people will be coming here, right, from other parts of the world. But I think a no border politics is one in which, those divisions no longer exist in the world, right? That it's not just about opening up the border as a symbolic kind of gesture to the world, but a no border politics is an end to imperialism. It's an end to forced displacement. It's an end to sweatshops. It's an end to trade agreements. It's an end, to anti-Black violence. It's an end to anti-Indigenous settler colonialism. It's an end to gendered violence. It's more expansive than that, and it rejects the idea that there is an apartheid world where there still is a global North and a global South, right? Like, that is a premise that we have to reject. And so I think we can hold all of those together in our movements, and the nuance between the present and the future in ways that are not compromising, that just, really depends on the context in which we're in.
That's great. Thank you so much. So we have time for, I think, one more question block and to give space for some Q&A. So I'm going to combine a couple thoughts that shift us into kind of an internationalist, anti-imperialist perspective. And so in your book, you quote Lisa Lowe, who talks about enslavement, settler colonialism, and racialized expropriation as being part of a continuum of conquest that we shouldn't think of as sequential events, right, but are ongoing in our contemporary moment. And at the same time, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, we are in, like, each historical moment, right, has particularities. And one is, the heightened nature of the crisis around migrant control, right, whether it's in the US, Australia, or Europe, EU. A tremendous investment, whether it's the Homeland Security or Frontex, in migrant control. And so along with the rise of the ethno-nationalist right, the climate crisis, the war on terror, all these things coming together, are there things that are unique about this particular conjuncture that you think we should be thinking about in terms of our organizing strategy as we think about building internationalist approaches to our work?
Yeah, I think one is exactly as you point out, that the context of the rise of the right is international. I think it's important to see it, of course, beyond election cycles. It's important to not see liberalism as a counter to fascism or the right, but really as something that fuels the fires of the right. And I think, an internationalist response to both the right and to fascism and to liberalism are what we need to confront all of those forces, and really to see it as international, right? To look at the trends. And I think one of the trends that I found in my work, particularly understanding this transnationally, is how central anti-migrant xenophobia is to the rise of the right in places all around the world. And I can't overstate this, because it is important to not flatten the rise of the right and say that it's one thing everywhere, right? Like, it has different tendencies in different places. And it looks differently in different places, even as there are similarities. Like, the rise of Hindutva looks different than Zionism, looks different than the rise of white supremacy. These are connected phenomenon, but they're distinct in how they play out in local context. But one of the things that we see in almost all factions of the far right is anti-migrant xenophobia, and really this inherent idea, which is the right, is of who's the us and who's the them, right? And how's the us and them, not just about difference, like that we are different from each other, which of course we are, but the us and them is being demarcated, of course, across lines of deep violence. And so I think that is one thing, is, just how central that is, and how escalating that is in the context of the climate crisis, like these new weaponizations of certain so-called progressive causes to further the right, so eco-apartheid becoming a growing phenomenon, where the climate crisis is now being weaponized by the right as a kind of, in order to justify gated communities, and to justify, the fortification of borders. Also in Europe, the very strong weaponization of feminism and queer and trans liberation in order to justify really anti-migrant xenophobia, right? The really old trope, but that's being reanimated, of migrants or those from the so-called third world being backwards, being primitive. Like, that's an old trope, but is being reanimated in particular ways. So I'd say, anti-migrant xenophobia, and then also the weaponization of particularly progressive causes in the service of the right and and nationalism. The other thing that I would offer, maybe the last one, is how important it is to understand, and this goes back to Lisa Lowe, how important it is to understand, I think, and I hope that this comes through in Border and Rule, particularly in tracing the historic formation of the southern border, of the US-Mexico border, that in order for the border to be anti-migrant, it is inherently also anti-Black and anti-Indigenous, right? That is the condition of possibility of migration controls. And so if we are thinking about the relationships between settler colonialism, enslavement, empire, and anti-migrant controls, that we increasingly strengthen an analysis of how these are not parallel struggles, or that these are not simply, all struggles for racial justice, but that these are mutually constituted through each other. And that, again, in order for the border to be anti-migrant, it is foundationally organized through anti-Black and anti-Indigenous violence, right? And that around the world, those who are disproportionately impacted by border controls are Black and Indigenous peoples. But oftentimes we assume it's kind of like, the struggles of non-Black, non-Indigenous people, right? That these are separate struggles. And so I think that's something else in thinking through Lisa Lowe's work and those continuities and those connections, and of course others as well, that I think is something that we can draw from.
That's great. I'm wondering if maybe to close out this section, if something comes to mind, an inspirational example of internationalist organizing, whether, for something that is like, do you have examples that you can draw from, that people tackling maybe in different geographic locations, some kind of global phenomenon like climate crisis or militarism, that might offer some lessons for us, those of us situated here or in Canada?
I found that organizing, and maybe this is me being very simplistic, and someone can hop on and be like, no, this isn't true, this is your rose-colored glasses from elsewhere. But I have found the ways in which organizing in Europe is, both attentive to migrant justice struggles, but in a way that is deeply anti-imperialist, that I think in both the US and Canada is often lacking, where again, immigrant rights movements are often siloed from that international analysis, not only of the world, but, even just implicating imperialism and climate change in the, in why people move. Is not, is often the kind of radical parts of immigrant rights movements, right? Like the mainstream immigrants' right movements are very much in the rights framework, the domesticated framework. From my observations in the context of Europe, I would say that those kinds of transnational organizing, also organizing with expelled deportees, where those who've been deported are still part of the struggle. Those relationships and alliances that are transnational, I think are deeply inspiring, and have really built a strong overall movement to dismantle the project of Fortress Europe, and to just actually challenge the idea of Europe, right? Like to challenge Europe, and to challenge Europe as the center of imperial power, and to locate that the entire condition of possibility of Europe is these conditions of enslavement, of imperialism, of empire, of indentureship, which I don't think we we do. And I think it's important because I think the last thing I'll say is that so problematic about these invocations of migrant crisis. There's a lot we can say about why that's a problematic framework. But I think one of the most insidious ones is its invocation as a new crisis, right? That the migrant crisis is new and it positions Western states as its victims. But it's so offensive because the entire condition of possibility of countries like the US and Canada is, is enslavement, is settler colonialism, is the free movement of settler colonists, while Africans and Asians are enslaved and indentured, right? And so I think in Europe, there's a deeper challenge to the entire notion of Europe and its condition of possibility as one rooted in violence and in transnational solidarity, that I don't think exists here, but that we can, I think, draw a lot of inspiration from.
Great. Thank you so much, Harsha, for all that you shared and your insights. So we're going to move to question and answer. Okay. I'll start, and then people, you can also still add questions, I think. I'm going to start with this question from Hina Sharma. Harsha, do you think it's possible for people to work towards PIC abolition without also working towards border abolition?
I don't think so. I think they are connected. I think the abolition of prisons, the abolition of police, the abolition of border controls, the abolition of imperialist militaries, the abolition of sweatshops are all connected visions, right? They're all a transnational vision of liberation from carceral regimes, from racial capitalism, from racial citizenship. And I don't think it's possible, even in a practical sense, because such a big part of the prison industrial complex is immigration detention centers, right? And so it's impossible to talk about the abolition of prisons without also talking about the abolition of jails and immigration detention. And in certain years in the United States, over half of all federal arrests were immigration related, right? So in that way, it's impossible to talk about abolishing the police without talking about its completely connected relationship to immigration and border enforcement. And so I think it's so necessary to see these as connected projects of carceral institutions. And the last thing that I would say is that, they operate through the same logic, right? One of the things that I learned, which is maybe a bit niche, but I find really interesting, is that in when I was researching for Border and Rule, one of the things that I learned was that the root of the word mob, or the ways in which the word mob has been derived. So mob is, we know, a criminalizing logic to criminalize poor Black and brown people in inner cities and at the border. That the word mob derives from the word mobility, right? And so the entire logic of carceral institutions is to create immobility. And borders and prisons and police work through the same logics of immobilization and social control. And I think in that way, there's a seamless connection where, no, I don't think we can have abolition of the prison industrial complex without also having the abolition of borders. And the very last thing is, Angela Davis and Gina Dent wrote back in the early 2000s, almost 20 years ago, that in one of the pieces that they wrote, drawing on work with incarcerated people and prisoners, was that they said that the prison is a border, and I think we can draw from that if the prison is a border, then the border is a prison, and they both have to be abolished together.
Do you think, Harsha, I'm curious, as struggles are, you had talked about how struggles for migrant justice often do not engage or have a strategy, an anti-imperialist strategy. So I guess I'm wondering if you're seeing it in practice or theoretically. Do you think also there's a similar, like, is the anti-imperialist work being done in the PIC abolition work more clearly? Like, are there lessons we can draw from there?
I think a lot of work, a lot of our movements are domesticated, right? Almost inherently so, in the sense of we're really focused on, and I think maybe this is part of what happens, particularly in the United States, is because the US is such a mass purveyor of violence, there's also a deep emphasis on organizing within the US, but also still internalizing the logic of the US, right? And so I think this is true for movements in North America in general, where we really organize, ironically, even as we try to be internationalist, we're still constrained in our nationalist imaginations and understandings, because I don't, for example, see a lot of connections being made about the abolition of police or prisons or detention centers internationally, or even about how the US, such a big part of policing in the US is the policing of other countries' police, right? Like the US pays for the training of police as part of its imperial project, in the same way that it pays for border outsourcing. It pays for it pays for for policing in Haiti. It pays for policing in Central America. That is part and parcel of imperialism. So I think in order to have a true expansive vision of abolition, we're looking at how imperialism is connected. I don't want to make any judgments. I'm not in the US and I don't know every movement, but I'd say in general, we have tendencies to think increasingly in nationalist ways, and we can all benefit from looking at how imperialism is a key part of how violence travels and how these structures travel.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left, I'm being told, for one more question. And so maybe I'll try to condense. There's a question in here about climate change and what the impacts that will be on migrants. I know that, I wonder if you could give one example, I know you do in your book, of like how this is playing out internationally, or somewhere climate change is playing out and how people are fighting back.
Sure, and thank you. I just want to acknowledge the various comments in the chat. Absolutely, the US pays for policing in Colombia and so many other places. Thank you for that. In terms of climate change, sorry, which question are we looking at? I was just realizing
there was a question in the Q&A about climate change and how people are going to have to move to smaller places. So
I think I see that. Yeah.
Yeah. I was wondering if there's a case study you just wanted to name.
Just that, climate change is increasingly becoming one of the fastest growing forms of displacement around the world, particularly coastal communities. Communities like Bangladesh, Tuvalu Islands in the Oceania. And I think this is where we have to be careful, right? Because the idea that there's diminishing space for all of us as a result of climate change is precisely what breeds eco-apartheid logics. In France, Marine Le Pen, for those who are unfamiliar, Marine Le Pen is one of the most far-right politicians in Europe, and has been thoroughly rejected over the years. But as things go, comes and goes in waves. But she's now making a scary comeback as a far-right politician by arguing that borders are an ecological defense because there will be less place, right? So she's like, we have to protect France and we have to protect our land mass after having, of course, ravaged the world, right, through imperialism. And as we know, climate change is not human, and it's corporate, militaristic, state-induced violence. It's not the carrying capacity of humans. Vast majority of global emissions are by corporations. But I think the trouble with arguments like overpopulation or shrinking land mass is that they're really kind of Malthusian theories that, again, really place the blame and the onus on Black and Brown people around the world. And so for me, I would encourage us to not think in those ideas of shrinking space, but really, again, turn the gaze and the responsibility back on states and corporations who are enacting this violence, and to really think about, our responsibilities, right? Our responsibilities to both ensure that people are not forcibly displaced, that people have a right to remain on their lands, that people have a right not to be displaced as a result of economic, social, political, or climate warfare, and that also people have the right to move, right? That we have a responsibility. And I think that to me is the fundamental idea around thinking about border violence as border imperialism, is that we are bound up in these violences. It's not about charity. It's not about quotas. It's not about, being benevolent towards immigrants and refugees. This is fundamentally about a form of reparations, and that so much violence has been wreaked and ravaged, has ravaged the world. And migration is a form of reparations. And I think, the simplest way is that slogan, we are here because you are there, right? We are here because you are there. And if we take that seriously, then anti-imperialism has to be central. It has to be central to migrant justice work, both in ensuring that no one is forcibly displaced due to imperialism, and also that people have the freedom to move. The freedom to stay and the freedom to move are not contradictory, that they're connected, interconnected visions of freedom and liberation, I think.
Well, it's time to close. I just wanted to end with much gratitude, Harsha, for your work, your organizing, and being able to share space with you tonight. And also to the Center for Political Education and those of you tuning in. This work is hard. And I know that sometimes when we think about these intersections, it can seem really overwhelming, but I actually feel very inspired in this, knowing that people are struggling. They've been struggling forever and they continue to struggle. And with insights and knowledge like this, we will persevere. We will win. So thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Harsha, for writing this incredible book. Thank you, Mizue, for being in conversation. And just to toot Mizue's horn, she's coming out with a report called Smart Borders or a Humane World with a group of awesome co-authors as well. We encourage you to stay tuned for it, and we'll definitely let you know when it comes out. And programs like our Third World series, our Writing the Third World series, are made possible by an incredible community of people like you who support the center to keep this programming possible. So we're going to drop a link to our donation page in the chat. Please consider giving to the center tonight or becoming a friend of CPE, meaning a monthly sustainer, and donating monthly. And there will be more events like this in this series. We have an upcoming conversation with Vijay Prashad and Rhonda Ramiro on Vijay's book, Washington Bullets. Stay tuned for that. Follow us on social media, sign up for our mailing list. And till then, in the words of Amilcar Cabral, learn from life, learn from our people, learn from books, learn from the experience of others, and never stop learning.